Recently, a friend posted this image to Facebook, and it got me thinking, why do churches focus so much on homosexuality? Not only is this question timely, both in terms of the Supreme Court's gay marriage ruling and of Kim Davis's recent shenanigans, but it's just generally a good question for Christians to think about. Now, I'm familiar with the biblical justification for saying homosexuality is a sin. Trust me, as a former evangelical who used to grab at every straw to defend this teaching, I know the verses all too well. I also know that Romans 1:21 through 27 describes homosexuality as a dishonorable passion that God will give sinners over to if they refuse to honor him. However, homosexuality has no great place of prominence as a sin in the Bible. As this graphic states, the prohibition against it does not even make the top 10. Rather, people obsess over homosexuality not for biblical reasons, but for current cultural ones. There's still a bit of lingering old-fashioned taboo against it. A lot of people think it's gross, and since many of us can't personally relate to the urge and might not even know openly practicing homosexuals, it's easier for us to distance ourselves from them, to dehumanize them, and to pit ourselves against them. I would imagine part of it also has to do with Christians digging in their heels against a culture they feel is trying to force acceptance upon them. But I actually want to turn the focus away from homosexuality and ask about the second part of this graphic. Why does it point out that adultery made the top 10? After all, as I mentioned in this reply, not boiling a goat in its mother's milk also made the top 10, depending on which version of the Ten Commandments you use. You see, there are multiple versions of what people today call the Ten Commandments. But the only top 10 that God put down in stone, and the only one the Bible names as the Ten Commandments, is a list in Exodus 34 that includes a law against treaties with other tribes, a prohibition against having yeast in sacrifices, instructions to observe a couple festivals, and yes, a command at the end prohibiting the cooking of a young goat in its mother's milk. That, ladies and gentlemen, is God's top 10. Yet somehow this list, which I'll repeat, is the only one the Bible calls the Ten Commandments, was allowed to fall by the wayside and is currently pretty much unknown to modern Christianity. But why? Why would Christians latch on to a series of commands God verbally spoke out in Exodus 20, yet entirely ignore God's actual written list of 10 commandments? The reason is clear. People recognize that several rules in the Exodus 20 list had actual moral value, so they use their own reasoning to decide that it was the better of the two lists. And that leads to why I believe that this graphic chose adultery over, say, cooking a goat in its mother's milk, or even observing the Sabbath, which by the way is in both sets of 10 Commandments. There's absolutely no reason, based on internal evidence in the Bible, for thinking prohibition against adultery carries more weight than the other two commands. Instead, adultery, or cheating on someone, makes this graphic more relevant to modern audiences because we see it as a reflection on a person's character. And we only see it as a reflection of character to the extent that it harms another person. Nobody, evangelical conservative Christians included, give a flying rip of which commandments are in God's actual top 10, or even which are given prominence in the Bible at all. We decide based on our own internal sense of justice. We ask ourselves, what's fair and unfair? What harms another person? Which behaviors help us cooperate as a society? By carefully considering these questions, we decide what's moral or immoral. And that's how we arrive at our universal list of behaviors that we would consider our top sins: murder, rape, torture, slavery, child abuse, bullying, and animal cruelty. These are behaviors that resonate most deeply with us, and we are pretty much in universal agreement about the fact that they're wrong. Then there are commands found in the Bible. They address things including observing the Sabbath, cooking a goat in its mother's milk, getting a circumcision, eating yeast. These actions are seen as being totally irrelevant to us, even though they are some of the most prominent amongst God's commands. Yes, there are some good teachings in the Bible, but we don't find them by looking for what God seems to express the most urgency about. We find them by looking for issues that we already care about. Murder, for example, is still relevant to us, not because it's in the Bible, but because it happens to overlap with the first list. Similarly, homosexuality is an issue for people not because an archaic law condemns it, but because it overlaps with people's list of prejudices. But this prejudice is fading, and quickly, and as it does, the prohibition against homosexuality will fall into obscurity among all the other biblical commands that were disconnected from morality. In the end, it will have nothing to do with what was or wasn't on God's top 10. It will be because, regardless of where homosexuality fell in the Bible, it just wasn't relevant. Sorry, Christians, it's happening whether you like it or not. In the meantime, let's use this as a lesson. Let's introspect about why some biblical teachings stick around and others fall by the wayside even among Christians. And let's ask ourselves, if we only worry about the parts of the Bible that intersect with our personal sense of morality, are we really using it for anything at all?